The car's engine hummed as the winding forest road stretched ahead, flanked by towering pines that seemed to whisper in the wind. Olivia glanced at the map on her phone, frowning slightly. "Are you sure this is the right way?" she asked, her voice tinged with doubt. "Relax," Jake said from the driver's seat, smirking. "The guy I rented the cabin from gave me perfect directions. We're almost there." In the back seat, Mia and Trevor were busy scrolling through their phones, occasionally pointing out random memes to each other. "I hope this place has decent Wi-Fi," Trevor muttered. "Wi-Fi?" Jake scoffed. "The whole point is to unplug, dude. No phones, no distractions, just us and nature." As the trees began to thin, the cabin came into view, a rustic, weathered structure perched on a small hill. It looked straight out of a postcard, with its wooden frame and a stone chimney that spiraled into the sky. A faint mist curled around its base, giving it an eerie charm. "This is it," Jake announced as he parked. Everyone got out, stretching and taking in their surroundings. The air was crisp, carrying the faint scent of pine and damp earth. "Looks peaceful," Olivia said, though her tone betrayed a sliver of unease. "More like isolated," Mia added, shivering slightly despite her thick jacket. Inside, the cabin was cozy but old-fashioned. The furniture was a mix of hand-carved wood and faded upholstery. A large fireplace dominated the living room, and a spiral staircase led to a second floor with small bedrooms. As they unpacked, Trevor noticed an old photograph on the mantel. It depicted a family of 4 standing in front of the cabin, their expressions unnervingly blank. "Creepy much?" he joked, holding it up for the others. "Just old," Jake said dismissively. "People used to look like that in photos. No big deal." Later that evening, they settled around the fireplace, laughing and swapping stories. The crackling flames cast flickering shadows on the walls, giving the room a warm but haunting glow. As the night wore on, they heard a knock on the door. Jake opened it to find an elderly man standing there, bundled in a heavy coat. "Evenin'," the man greeted, his voice gravelly. "Name's Harold. I take care of this property for the owner. Just wanted to remind y'all, stay indoors after dark. The woods can get tricky at night." Before they could ask what he meant, Harold tipped his hat and disappeared into the trees. "What was that about?" Mia asked, uneasily glancing at the windows. "Probably just trying to scare us," Jake replied, brushing it off. "Old guy vibes, you know?" But as the group prepared for bed, Olivia couldn't shake the feeling that Harold's warning wasn't just idle talk. The cabin fell silent as the group settled into their rooms. The wind outside howled faintly, rattling the windows. Olivia lay in bed, staring at the wooden beams above her. Harold's words echoed in her mind, "Stay indoors after dark." Somewhere down the hall, Trevor's voice broke the stillness. "Jake, are you snoring already?" "Not me," Jake called back, groggy. "It's probably the wind." Olivia closed her eyes, trying to drift off, but the quiet didn't last long. "Help me." Her eyes snapped open. The voice was faint, almost drowned by the wind, but it was there, coming from outside. She sat up, straining to listen. "Please, help me." It sounded closer this time. Heart pounding, Olivia slipped out of bed and crept to the window. The forest outside was a dark mass of shifting shadows, and the mist seemed thicker than before, curling around the trees like grasping fingers. "Olivia, is that you?" She froze. The voice now sounded like Mia's, but muffled and distorted. Olivia quickly glanced back toward the hallway. She could see Mia's door, slightly ajar, and hear her soft breathing. The voice called again, louder this time. "Olivia, come outside." Panicked, she rushed to Jake's room, shaking him awake. "Jake! There's something outside." He groaned, rubbing his eyes. "What are you talking about?" "Voices," she whispered. "Someone's out there." Jake, clearly annoyed, got out of bed and followed her to the living room. They found Trevor and Mia already there, both looking uneasy. "Did you hear it too?" Mia asked. Yeah, Trevor added. It sounded like someone calling for help. Almost familiar. Jake grabbed a flashlight from the shelf. All right, let's check it out. Are you insane? Olivia hissed, grabbing his arm. Harold said to stay inside. And you believe him? Jake countered. If someone's out there and they need help, we can't just ignore it. Despite Olivia's protests, Jake opened the front door. The cold night air rushed in, carrying with it a strange stillness. The forest seemed to hold its breath as the group stepped onto the porch, the flashlight beam cutting through the mist. Hello? Jake called out. No answer. They moved cautiously, their breaths visible in the chilly air. The mist thickened with every step, swallowing the cabin behind them. Over here, the voice cried. This time, it sounded like Trevor's. Trevor stopped in his tracks, his face pale. That's my voice. Before anyone could respond, a sharp cracking sound echoed through the trees. The group froze, scanning the shadows, but saw nothing. We need to go back, Olivia whispered. Jake nodded reluctantly. As they turned toward the cabin, the mist seemed to close in around them. The porch light was barely visible, flickering faintly in the distance. They hurried back inside, slamming the door behind them. The warmth of the cabin felt suffocating now, the once cozy atmosphere heavy with unease. What the hell was that? Mia demanded, her voice trembling. No idea, Jake admitted, his bravado shaken. Olivia locked the door and checked the windows, her mind racing. Whatever was out there, it wasn't just the wind, or their imaginations. And the voice, it had known her name. Morning came reluctantly, with pale light filtering through the cabin's thin curtains. None of them had slept well. The events of the night lingered in the air, unspoken but heavy. Jake sat at the kitchen table, stirring his coffee absently. So, do we talk about it or pretend it didn't happen? Mia dropped into the chair opposite him, her face pale. It wasn't just the wind, Jake. I heard my mom's voice. She's not even here, but I heard her. Trevor paced near the fireplace, running his hands through his hair. It wasn't just you. I heard my own voice. That's not normal. Olivia stood by the window, staring out at the mist that still clung to the trees. It hadn't dissipated with the sunrise. We shouldn't have gone outside, she said quietly. It's like, whatever's out there knows us now. Jake sighed, placing his mug down. Okay, but what do we do? We've got 2 more nights here. We can't just sit around freaking out. Mia glanced toward the mantel, where the old photograph still stood. Maybe we should leave. This place, it doesn't feel right. Leave? Jake shook his head. We rented this place for the weekend. We're not running because of some spooky noises. But Olivia turned away from the window, her expression hard. Jake, it's more than that. I think it wants something from us. Before he could argue, Trevor called out. Guys, look at this. He was crouched near the fireplace, holding an old, leather-bound book that had been wedged between the stones. Its cover was cracked, the pages yellowed with age. Where'd you find that? Mia asked, moving closer. Just here, Trevor replied, flipping through the pages. It's some kind of journal. Jake leaned over his shoulder, squinting at the faded handwriting. It's in English, but it's old. Like, really old. Olivia knelt beside them. What does it say? Trevor began to read aloud, his voice steady despite the eerie words. They call to us in familiar tones. The voices are not what they seem. They are echoes of the lost, used to lure us into the woods. Beware the mist. Once it knows your name, it will never let you leave. The room fell silent. Mia hugged herself, her face stricken. This can't be real. This is just some crazy person's ramblings, right? Olivia's voice was low. What if it's not? What if this has happened before? The voices, the mist, it's all in here. Jake stood abruptly, rubbing the back of his neck. Okay, so let's say this journal is legit. What do we do? Sit around until something worse happens? Trevor kept reading, flipping to the last few pages. His face paled as he whispered, "There's more." "What?" Olivia asked. Trevor swallowed hard. "It says, burn the cabin. Only then will the cycle break." The weight of the journal's words hung heavy in the room. Jake paced in front of the fireplace, the wooden floor creaking under his steps. "We're not burning anything," he said firmly, though his voice betrayed his unease. "This could just be some weird prank or superstition." Olivia shook her head, her eyes narrowing. "And what if it's not? What if we ignore this and something worse happens?" Trevor placed the journal carefully on the table, his hands trembling slightly. "There's more in here. It talks about the voices getting stronger, pulling people into the woods. Once someone's out there for too long, they don't come back." Mia let out a shaky breath. "We need to leave. Now." Jake turned to her, frustrated. "And go where?" "The nearest town is 2 hours away, and that's if we can even get through this mist. It's like it's alive." Olivia's gaze shifted back to the window. The mist seemed denser now, pressing against the glass like an unwelcome visitor. "Maybe it doesn't want us to leave," she said quietly. Her words sent a chill through the group. Trevor flipped another page of the journal. "There's a map in here," he said, pointing to a crude drawing of the cabin and the surrounding woods. "It marks a spot nearby. Says something about an old altar." "An altar?" Mia's voice quivered. "It's connected to the voices," Trevor continued. "Something about where they're strongest." Jake grabbed the flashlight again, shaking his head. "If we're going to figure this out, we need answers. Sitting here isn't going to help." "You're not seriously going out there again," Olivia snapped, stepping in front of him. "We can't just wait around." Jake shot back. "If there's something out there causing this, maybe we can stop it." Reluctantly, Olivia, Mia, and Trevor agreed to follow. Armed with the flashlight, the journal, and a growing sense of dread, they stepped into the mist once more. The forest was unnervingly quiet. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the sound of their footsteps crunching on the damp ground. Trevor led the way, the map clutched tightly in his hands. "It should be close," he muttered. As they walked, the voices began again, faint at first but growing louder with each step. "Jake," a voice called, eerily similar to Olivia's. "Over here," another voice whispered, its tone mimicking Mia's. They stopped abruptly, the air thick with tension. Olivia turned in a circle, scanning the shadows. "Don't listen to them," she warned. "They're trying to confuse us." The group pressed on, their nerves fraying with every passing second. Finally, they reached a clearing. In the center stood a crumbling stone altar, covered in moss and carved with symbols that seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. Trevor hesitated. "This is it," he said, his voice barely audible. Jake approached the altar cautiously, shining the flashlight over its surface. "Looks old, but what's it for?" Olivia pointed to a small metal box embedded in the base of the altar. "Open it," she urged. Jake pried the box loose and lifted its lid. Inside was a bundle of papers, brittle with age, and a knife with an ornate handle. Trevor unfolded the papers, his face growing paler with each word. "It's a ritual," he said, his voice trembling. "To bind the voices here. Someone did this, to trap them. And now they want out," Olivia whispered, her stomach sinking. The mist thickened, swirling around them as the voices grew deafening, overlapping in an endless, desperate chorus. "Leave," one screamed. "Stay," another cried. "Free us." Jake dropped the box, stumbling back. "We need to get out of here," he said, panic finally breaking through his bravado. But as they turned to leave, the mist seemed to solidify, forming vague, shadowy shapes that blocked their path. The shadows in the mist grew darker, coalescing into forms that loomed over the group. Their outlines were human but distorted, their movements unnervingly slow and deliberate. "Back up!" Jake shouted, waving the flashlight wildly. The beam cut through the figures but did nothing to dispel them. "Run!" Olivia yelled, grabbing Mia's arm and pulling her toward the trees. Trevor hesitated, clutching the journal, but the sight of a shadow lurching toward him jolted him into action. The group stumbled through the forest, the mist clawing at them like unseen hands. The voices followed, louder and more insistent. "Come back, stay with us, don't leave." Jake tripped over a root, falling hard to the ground. Trevor skidded to a stop, helping him up. "We can't keep running," Trevor panted. "They're everywhere." Olivia spun around, her eyes blazing with determination. "The cabin. We have to go back. If what the journal says is true, we need to end this." Jake hesitated, but the encroaching shadows made the decision for him. "Fine," he muttered. "Let's go." They retraced their steps, the cabin's faint outline barely visible through the mist. As they reached the porch, Olivia slammed the door shut behind them, bolting it tightly. The voices didn't stop. They seeped through the walls, through the cracks in the wood, growing sharper and more menacing. Mia collapsed onto the couch, trembling. "What do we do?" "They're not going to stop." Trevor placed the journal on the table, flipping back to the section about the ritual. "It says the cabin is the anchor," he explained, his voice shaky. "The voices are tied to it. If we destroy it." "We destroy them," Olivia finished, her voice grim. Jake grabbed a canister of kerosene from the storage closet. "Let's get this over with." But as he unscrewed the cap, a voice cut through the air, distinct and haunting. "Jake, it's your brother." Jake froze. His brother had died years ago, and yet the voice was unmistakable. "No," he whispered, his grip on the canister loosening. The others stared in horror as the voice continued, dripping with false warmth. "Don't do this, Jake. You don't have to hurt us." "Jake, don't listen," Olivia shouted, grabbing the canister from his hands. "It's lying." The cabin groaned, the walls creaking as if under immense pressure. The shadows outside pressed harder against the windows, their forms growing sharper, more defined. Trevor lit a match, his hand trembling. "This has to work," he murmured. "Wait!" Jake yelled, but Trevor had already dropped the match onto the kerosene-soaked floor. The fire roared to life, consuming the old wood with startling speed. The voices screamed, a cacophony of rage and anguish that reverberated through the cabin. "Go! Now!" Olivia yelled, pushing Mia toward the door. The group fled into the mist, the flames behind them rising higher and higher. The cabin's structure groaned and cracked, the firelight casting wild shadows on the trees. As they reached the clearing, the mist began to thin, retreating like a tide. The voices faded, their cries growing distant until they were nothing more than a faint echo. The cabin collapsed in on itself, the fire devouring it completely. The group stood in silence, watching as the fire reduced the cabin to smoldering ash. The mist had vanished, leaving the forest unnervingly clear under the pale light of the moon. For the first time since their arrival, the air felt still, free from the oppressive weight that had clung to them. "Is it over?" Mia whispered, her voice barely audible. Trevor nodded slowly, clutching the singed journal. "I think so. The anchor's gone. They can't hold on anymore." Jake remained silent, staring at the charred remains. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. Olivia placed a hand on his shoulder, but he didn't respond. "We should go," she said, her voice firm. "There's nothing left for us here." They made their way back to the car, their steps heavy with exhaustion. The drive to the nearest town was quiet, each of them lost in their thoughts. When they reached a small roadside diner at dawn, they stopped to regroup. Inside, the warmth and light felt surreal, almost out of place after the night they had endured. They ordered coffee, barely touching it as they sat around the table in a daze. "We need to tell someone," Olivia said, breaking the silence. "The police, or someone." "And say what?" Jake snapped, his voice harsh. "That a haunted cabin tried to kill us?" They'll think we're insane." "She's right," Trevor said, his tone weary. "People need to know. What if someone else goes out there?" Jake leaned back, rubbing his face with his hands. "There's nothing to go back to. It's gone. We made sure of that." But as the conversation continued, Olivia's eyes wandered to the corner of the diner. An old bulletin board hung there, cluttered with flyers and photographs. One in particular caught her attention, a faded picture of a family standing in front of a cabin. Her stomach dropped. It was the same photograph from the mantel. "Guys," she said, her voice trembling. "Come look at this." The group gathered around her, staring at the photograph. Beneath it was a handwritten note. "Missing since 1978. Last seen near Black Hollow Woods." "That's impossible," Mia stammered. Olivia's hand shook as she pointed to the small figures in the background of the photo. At first glance, they seemed like shadows cast by the family. But the longer they stared, the clearer the shapes became, vague, human-like figures, identical to the ones they had seen in the mist. Trevor stepped back, clutching the journal. "We didn't stop it," he whispered. "We just released it." Jake's face twisted in disbelief, but before he could respond, the bell above the diner door chimed. A rush of cold air swept in as an elderly man stepped inside, bundled in a heavy coat. It was Harold. He smiled at them, tipping his hat. "Mornin'. Hope y'all enjoyed your stay." The group froze, dread washing over them like a tidal wave. Harold's eyes gleamed with something dark, something ancient. "You're not Harold," Olivia said, her voice barely audible. The man's smile widened, but he said nothing. Turning on his heel, he left as quietly as he had entered, leaving the door swinging in his wake. For a moment, no one moved. Then Trevor opened the journal, flipping frantically through the pages. His face went pale as he reached the last one. "It's blank," he choked out. "Everything's gone." The realization hit them all at once. Whatever had been bound to the cabin wasn't just free, it was out in the world now, and it wasn't done with them.